Part 1. The Prometheus Switch. The silence in the command deck of the UNS Sagan was not empty. It was pressurized. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of 300 people holding their breath at the edge of history. Dr. Aris Thorne stood by the reinforced viewport, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of the red planet. From this altitude, Mars didn't look like a planet. It looked like a wound in the side of the universe, scabbed, ancient, and waiting to be healed. T-minus 10 minutes to sequence Alpha. The flight director's voice cut through the air, perfectly leveled, betraying none of the terror or ecstasy that Aris knew she felt. "You look like you're attending a funeral, Doctor," a voice rumbled beside him. Aris didn't turn. He knew the smell of cigars and gun oil that clung to General Vance, even in a recycled atmosphere. Not a funeral, General, a resurrection. But sometimes the two feel dangerously similar. Vance huffed, crossing his thick arms. 50 years of construction, 4 trillion credits. The Ares bloom is ready. Today, we stop being a one-planet species. You should be smiling. You designed the geology protocols, didn't you? I designed the crustal stabilizers, Aris corrected softly. I wanted to make sure that when we heat the planet up, it doesn't crack open like an egg. He looked out at the orbital array. The Ares bloom was a constellation of 700 massive orbital mirrors, arranged in a flower petal formation around the Martian poles. On the surface below, fusion-driven atmospheric processors, the size of cities, sat silent, waiting for the signal to belch gigatons of superheated greenhouse gases into the thin air. The plan was brutal but effective. Melt the poles, thicken the atmosphere, and let the greenhouse effect do the rest. In 100 years, humans could walk on the surface with only a breathing mask. In 300, they could walk without one, T-minus 5 minutes. The main holographic display in the center of the deck shifted from tactical schematics to a live feed of the North Pole. The ice caps were dirty white, scarred by eons of dust storms. Energy transfer initiated, a technician called out. Mirrors are aligning, solar collection at 98% efficiency. Aris felt a vibration in the floor plates. It was the Sagan adjusting its attitude, preparing for the thermal bloom. He checked his tablet. The seismic sensors on the surface were reading nominal. The background radiation was standard. Everything was perfect. So why was the hair on the back of his neck standing up? General, Aris said, frowning at his data stream. I'm seeing a gravimetric fluctuation. Sector 4. Vance glanced at the screen. A glitch? We're 4 minutes out, Thorne. Don't get jittery. It's not a glitch. The gravitons are bunching, like space is getting heavy. Aris tapped the screen furiously. Sensor telemetry. Sweep the Lagrange points. Now. Belay that, Vance barked. Focus on the bloom. General, look at the readings. Aris pointed. The graph wasn't jagged. It was a flat vertical line. A sudden, impossible spike in mass where there should be nothing but vacuum. T-minus 2 minutes. Mirrors locked. Something is out there, Aris whispered. The reading was massive. It wasn't an asteroid. Asteroids didn't appear out of thin air. The mass reading was equivalent to a small moon, and it had just manifested directly between the Sagan and the Martian surface. Abort, Aris said, his voice rising. General, abort the sequence. We are not aborting for a ghost signal, Doctor. It's not a ghost, it's a wall. T-minus 60 seconds. The lights on the bridge flickered. The hum of the reactor deepened, groaning as if the ship were suddenly struggling to maintain orbit. Collision alarm, the tactical officer screamed. Contact, massive contact, dead ahead. Through the viewport, the stars disappeared. It didn't happen with a flash of light or a warp signature. It was simply an imposition of reality. 1 second, there was the void of space and the red curve of Mars. The next, there was structure. A monolith. It was matte black, absorbing the starlight. A rectangular slab the size of a continent, hanging in low orbit. It was perfectly geometric, its surface detailed with intricate, branching canyons that glowed with a faint violet luminescence. And it wasn't alone. "Multiple contacts," the tactical officer shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm reading 12, no, 20, 40 objects. They're forming a grid." Around the planet, a lattice of these black shapes materialized, linking together with beams of violet light. They slotted between the humanity's orbital mirrors and the planet's surface, effectively cutting off the Ares bloom from its target. "What is that?" Vance whispered, his face pale. "It's a shield," Aris realized, watching the telemetry. "Or a cage! They're jamming us," someone yelled. "We've lost contact with Surface Command. We've lost the mirrors." "Weapons free," Vance roared, snapping out of his shock. "Target the nearest obstruction. Fire main batteries." "No!" Aris lunged forward, grabbing the general's arm. "Look at the energy output. That thing isn't just a ship, General. That single object has an energy signature higher than our sun. You fire a nuke at that, it might just bounce back." "Get your hands off me, Thorne. We are under attack." "We aren't under attack. If they wanted us dead, we'd be dead already. Look." Aris pointed to the main screen. The Ares bloom mirrors were firing. The automated sequence hadn't been stopped. Beams of concentrated solar energy, hot enough to melt continents, slammed into the black monoliths. The bridge crew flinched, expecting a blinding explosion. Instead, the black surface of the alien object rippled like water. The solar beams hit the violet lights and vanished. Absorbed, eaten. "They just drank it?" the tactical officer whispered. "They drank a terawatt of energy like it was nothing." The silence returned, but this time it was terrified. The countdown clock on the wall hit 0. The Ares bloom had technically fired, but Mars remained cold, shadowed beneath the lattice of the new arrivals. Then the sound came. It wasn't a sound over the speakers. It was a sound inside their skulls. A resonant, bone-shaking thrum that bypassed the ears and vibrated the temporal lobe directly. Every crew member grabbed their head, wincing in unison. The main screen scrambled. Static washed over the tactical maps. Then, the static cleared, replaced by a symbol. It was a simple, rotating icosahedron, a 20-sided shape, pulsing with that same violet light. A voice spoke. It did not sound biological. It sounded like grinding stones and synthesized choral music, layered over each other to form human words. "The ignition is halted." The voice echoed in the bridge, though no speakers were active. "Proximity alert. Species designation, Sol 3. You have breached the perimeter." General Vance shook his head, fighting the headache. "Identify yourself," he shouted at the screen, though there was no microphone. "This is General Vance of the United Earth Coalition. You are interfering with a sovereign operation." The symbol on the screen pulsed faster. "We are the Custodians. This planet is not a destination. It is a silo. Turn your vessels around. The tomb must remain sealed." "Tomb?" Aris stepped closer to the screen, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What tomb? There's nothing down there but dust and oxides." The voice paused. When it returned, the tone had shifted. It was no longer a robotic warning. It sounded almost pitying. "The dust is the lock. The oxide is the chain. You are children playing with a grenade, mistaking a tea for a ball. Depart, or be nullified." The screen went black. The violet lattice around Mars flared brighter, pulsating with a warning energy that made the sensors scream. "General," the flight director said, her voice trembling. "They've locked our helm controls. The Sagan, it's being pushed away." Aris looked out the window. The massive black slab was moving slightly, and the Sagan, a ship of 2 million tons, was being gently, effortlessly shoved away from Mars by an invisible wave of gravity. "We need to call Earth," Vance said, his jaw set. "Tell High Command we have a first contact scenario, and tell them to ready the orbital railguns." "General, listen to them," Aris pleaded. They called it a silo. They called the oxide a chain. That's specific. That's scientific data, not a threat. It's a blockade, Doctor. Vance turned, his eyes hard. And humanity doesn't tolerate walls. Aris looked back at the planet. The red world was now encased in a cage of black and violet. For the first time in 50 years, he didn't see a future home. He looked at the vast deserts of rust, the deep scars of the Vias Marineris, and he wondered for the first time. Why is Mars red? Planets don't just rust. Iron doesn't oxidize on a planetary scale without a massive amount of oxygen and water, which then seemingly vanished. The dust is the lock. God help us, Aris whispered. I think they're protecting us. Part 2. The Silence of the Spheres. Setting: United Earth Coalition, UEC. Headquarters, Geneva, Earth. Time: 5 hours after the Martian blockade. Africa emoji, the global fracture. The global reaction was not panic, but a deep, horrified silence, followed by a catastrophic eruption of noise. The moment the Custodian's message, "The tomb must remain sealed," faded, the world fractured. The unified global network, which had broadcast the Aries Bloom ceremony as a celebration of human ingenuity, instantly transformed into a splintered mosaic of terror. On every channel, the same 3 images repeated: the black, silent monoliths orbiting Mars, the terrified, pale face of General Vance giving a canned, evasive statement, and the spectral, geometric image of the pulsating icosahedron. In Geneva, UAC headquarters was a fortress under siege, not by rockets, but by data. Financial markets around the globe halted, having instantly shed 80% of their value in the wake of the message. The entire space infrastructure sector, the largest industry of the 21st century, was now worthless. Dr. Aris Thorne had been shuttled back to Earth on an emergency high-speed transfer shuttle, the G-forces barely mitigated by the sedative cocktail pumping into his arm. He was now sequestered in the UAC's subterranean analysis chamber, a soundproofed vault usually reserved for nuclear strategy. He sat across a cold metal table from his former mentor, Professor Lena Harmon, head of the UAC's Xenolinguistics division. She looked ancient, her eyes red-rimmed and staring at the holographic projection of the Custodian Signal Matrix, CSM, the pattern they had captured from the Sagan. "It's not communication, Aris," Lena muttered, running a hand through her thin gray hair. "It's a command, a pre-recorded, absolute instruction. There's no syntax structure, no request for dialogue. It's an environmental warning label." "The language," Aris insisted, pointing to the analysis of the auditory segment. "It utilized every known linguistic frequency, dead and alive, simultaneously. It was designed to pierce the psychological barrier, not the language one. And look at the word choice: tomb, silo, chain, metaphor, Aris. A species this advanced can frame threats poetically." "But why the oxide, Lena? The oxide is the chain? If they are protecting Mars from us, why go to such geological specifics? It suggests they have a deep functional understanding of the planet's chemical composition, or maybe they created it." Crossed swords emoji, the war room. The argument was interrupted by a flashing red priority marker. The UAC High Command had convened. Aris was required. The war room felt like an oven. General Vance was present, flanked by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, looking energized by conflict, the fear he felt in orbit replaced by an animalistic certainty. "Dr. Thorne," General Vance's voice boomed, amplified by the room's acoustics. "Enough of this academic postulating. We need an actionable strategy. Are these Custodians a military threat we can match?" "General, no," Aris said, stepping up to the podium. He brought up a new analysis on the main screen: Graviton Density Readings, GDR. "Our ships use propulsion. They use reaction mass," Aris explained, pointing to the graph. "The Custodian monoliths use zero energy for movement. When they materialized, they created a localized space-time fold. They didn't fly to Mars. They moved Mars to them. Or rather, they made the space between them and Mars instantaneously zero. A high-ranking naval admiral shifted uncomfortably. Explain that in military terms, Doctor. It means they do not exist within our physical reality constraints. They did not block the Ares bloom with force. They blocked it with geometry. Trying to fight them with kinetic or nuclear weapons is like attacking a three-dimensional object with a two-dimensional drawing. The attack will simply pass through or be redirected. General Vance slammed his hand on the table. I reject that premise. They are physical objects. They absorbed our solar energy, didn't they? That is a form of defensive shield. Every shield has a limit. That wasn't a shield, General, Aris countered, his voice steadying despite his inner turmoil. That was a consumption event. They absorbed a terawatt of solar energy and their ambient temperature didn't even fluctuate. The only thing that does that is a near-perfect Dyson sphere segment or something completely outside our thermodynamics. They are invaders, Thorne, Vance spat. They appeared in our system and declared our planet a danger zone. They are claiming the future of humanity. No, Aris insisted, shaking his head. They explicitly said, the tomb must remain sealed. They didn't say, the planet is ours. They are enforcing a quarantine, and given their power, we must assume they have a legitimate reason to quarantine Mars. Rocket emoji, the Terra First contingency. The political pressure on the UAC president, who was watching the debate remotely, was immense. The influential Terra First Party, a hyper-nationalist movement dedicated to Martian colonization, was inciting riots across every major city, demanding retribution. The argument shifted from, can we fight them? To, what must we show them? We must show intent, the president's voice crackled through the secure line. The people need to see that we will not back down. We cannot simply retreat and abandon Mars forever. After 3 hours of agonizing debate, General Vance's hardline approach won the day. A compromise was reached, driven by fear of political collapse rather than military confidence. The actionable strategy, Operation Scythe. It was a highly classified, limited probe action. A single, unmanned, stealth military vessel, the Vulture, would be launched from the lunar base. It was equipped with the most advanced cloaking technology and a revolutionary short-range warp drive shunt designed to jump the ship past close-range sensors. The objective, Vance concluded, staring directly at Aris Thorne, is not destruction. It is observation. The Vulture will use the shunt drive to briefly enter the perimeter, take sensor readings, and exit immediately. We need to know what they are defending the barrier with. Is it particle weapons? Is it gravity manipulation? We will not fire unless fired upon. Aris stared at the general, his face etched with defeat and growing horror. General, their warning was clear. They are enforcing a static boundary. Any attempt to breach that boundary will be interpreted as a full declaration of hostility, regardless of your intent. Then let them make the next move, Vance replied with a predatory smile. We will not be intimidated. As the meeting dispersed, Aris felt a sickening premonition. He knew exactly how the Custodians operated. They had effortlessly moved a 3 million-ton starship with a wave of gravity. They hadn't warned us away. They had defined a boundary, using physics as their weapon. He rushed out of the war room, fighting his way through the security detail, knowing that the launch of the Vulture was imminent. Humanity was about to test the patience of its jailers. And when the jailers inevitably responded, Aris had a terrible feeling that the response wouldn't be a demonstration of force, but the implementation of a silent, final protocol. Part 3. The Cage, Rocket Emoji. The Vulture's Gambit. The silence at the Unified Lunar Base, ULB, launch bay was absolute, broken only by the hiss of cooling vents and the rhythmic beep of life support. 60 kilometers away, the needle-like chassis of the Vulture, humanity's most advanced stealth probe, sat secured on its magnetic rails, awaiting launch. Inside the ULB command center, Captain Marcus Alara was strapped into the remote pilot chair. He was the most decorated test pilot in the UAC, his hands now resting on controls designed to manage a short-range, experimental warp drive shunt, a technology meant to punch momentary holes in space-time. "Internal clocks aligned," Alara reported, his voice tight. "Shunt readiness at 99%. Cloak integrity nominal. We're running at 0 radar and thermal signature." In Geneva, General Vance watched the feed, a triumvirate of political leaders hovering behind him. "Remember your objective, Captain. Get inside the perimeter. Get a clean sensor sweep. Get out. If they react, we abort instantly." Aris Thorne stood against a back wall in the UAC war room, his arms crossed, watching the clock tick down. He knew the cloaking was useless. The custodians weren't detecting electromagnetic radiation. They were reading the gravitational noise of the probe's reactor, the subtle neutrino signature of its moving parts, and, most crucially, the stress signature of the shunt drive tearing spacetime. "Vance is sending a telegram, not a probe," Aris muttered to Professor Harmon, who stood beside him. "A very expensive telegram," she replied grimly. "And I suspect the custodians already know the contents." The countdown ended. The Vulture launched with a whisper of magnetically accelerated plasma. It was instantly consumed by the void, racing the 5-hour distance to the Martian perimeter at near light speed. The breach. The flight was uneventful until the Vulture reached the outer edges of the Custodian field, a region of space where background radiation began to twist and shimmer, visible only to specialized sensors. "Approaching the boundary," Alara's voice was strained. "Gravimetric readings are spiking. It feels like flying through thick honey." On the Geneva screen, the Custodian lattice, the black violet-veined monoliths, hung still and silent, indifferent to the microscopic intrusion racing toward them. "Execute Shunt Protocol Beta," Vance ordered. Alara engaged the drive. For a fraction of a second, the universe warped. Space-time folded inward, and the Vulture ceased to exist in its current location. When the fold snapped back, the probe was 10 kilometers inside the Custodian perimeter, past the main defense line. "We are inside," Alara shouted, relief flooding his voice. "Confirmed breach. Running sensor sweep. Data incoming, General." Jubilation erupted in the war room. They had done it. They had defied the gatekeepers, the torsion field. The celebration lasted exactly 3.7 seconds. The nearest black monolith, miles away, did not move. It did not fire a laser, a missile, or a particle beam. Instead, the faint violet tracery on its surface brightened to a searing white, and the gravitational field around the probe instantly reversed itself. "Sir, massive energy surge," the tactical officer in Geneva yelled. "Not EM. It's pure graviton inversion," Captain Alara screamed, a raw, primal sound that cut out abruptly. On the main screen, the data stream from the Vulture didn't simply cease. It fragmented, showing an image that defied Newtonian physics. The probe's own light signature appeared to wrap around itself. "What's happening to the sensor feed?" Vance demanded, his face white. Aris rushed to the primary display, tapping commands. "It's not a weapon, General. It's a torsion field. They haven't destroyed the probe. They've inverted its geometry. The Custodians didn't attack the matter. They attacked the space that contains the matter." "Explain." "The probe is still physically there, but its position in three-dimensional space has been rotated into the fourth dimension," Aris explained, his voice shaking. "It is perfectly intact, but its spatial orientation is now inaccessible to us. It has been entropically quarantined." In simpler terms, the Vulture was now facing an impossible direction in an impossible way. Its internal mechanisms were intact, but its existence had been redefined to ensure it could never interact with the three-dimensional universe again. It was a perfect, silent, bloodless nullification. "Captain Alara's neural link is gone," the tactical officer announced, his voice flat with dread. "He's not dead, he's just not here anymore. The connection was severed by the inversion." General Vance stared at the dark screen, his confidence utterly obliterated. His great military gambit had resulted in the loss of a multi-billion-dollar prototype and the disabling of a top pilot, all without the Custodians expending a single unit of discernible force. "They're not just strong, General," Aris said, stepping away from the data console. "They are fundamental. They manipulate the laws of physics itself." The invitation. A moment later, the terrible, resonant thrum that had shaken the Sagan returned, but this time it was exquisitely localized, focused only on the command deck in Geneva. The main screen, which had been blank, flickered to life. The icosahedron symbol returned, now glowing with a colder, silver light. The grinding, synthesized voice spoke again. This time, there was no mass broadcast. It was aimed solely at the UAC leadership. Species Sol 3. The attempt to force entry is logically flawed. The cage is an imperative. Repetition will result in escalation. We will not nuke your home world. We will simply nullify the gravitational constant within your atmospheric envelope. You will cease to be an organized society. The threat was mathematically terrifying. Then, the message shifted, losing its cold, mechanical certainty and adopting a peculiar, inquisitive tone. Analysis of recorded debate shows one subunit, designation Durar, a Thorne, possesses a non-aggressive, data-driven interpretation of our stance. Aris froze. His quiet protest, his frantic analysis, his very mindset, had been monitored, scrutinized, and judged. The screen pulsed. Custodian Protocol 4. Primary Liaison. We demand interaction with Dr. Aris Thorne. Send him across the boundary, alone, or the silence returns permanently. The screen dissolved back into the tactical map, where the black lattice around Mars shone, waiting. General Vance turned slowly, his eyes fixed on Aris Thorne. The scientist, the man he had dismissed as a jittery academic, was now the only bridge between Earth and annihilation. "Well, Doctor," Vance whispered, his voice broken. "It looks like you're going back to Mars." Part 4. Vector Approach, Satellite Emoji. The White Flag. Dr. Aris Thorne stood in the cramped cockpit of the Diplomat, a single-occupancy orbital service shuttle stripped of all non-essential hardware, and painted a brilliant, defiant white. It carried no weapons, no heavy armor, and only enough fuel for the one-way trip to the Custodian perimeter. His reflection in the main viewport showed a man who had not slept in 2 days, wearing a simple civilian pressure suit, a deliberate choice to contrast with the military presence that had just been nullified. "The Diplomat's hull is broadcasting UAC surrender code Gamma 7 on all frequencies." General Vance's voice crackled over the comms, cold and devoid of his earlier bluster. "We are committed, Doctor. Do not fail this. You are carrying the weight of 3 billion lives." "The weight is noted, General," Aris replied, a hollow ache settling in his chest. "But I am not carrying a weapon. I am carrying a question." He ignited the small plasma thrusters. The Diplomat pushed off the Sagan, a lonely speck of white against the monumental blackness of space, crossing the event horizon. The journey was slow and agonizing. As he approached the geometric lattice of the Custodian monoliths, the sensory distortion began. The ship's internal chronometer began to drift, jumping backward and forward by milliseconds. Mars, visible through the windshield, seemed to shimmer and breathe, its red surface stretching and contracting as if viewed through an impossible lens. 30 seconds to perimeter entry, Aris reported calmly, his hands resting lightly on the controls. He was fully aware that the very laws of physics were about to change around him. The Custodian monoliths, which had been perfectly static, now began a slow, majestic rotation. The violet glowing canyons on their surface deepened in hue, and the space between them was filled with an increasing density of graviton energy. Then he hit the threshold. It wasn't a wall, it was a shift. Aris felt a sickening lurch in his stomach as the shuttle passed through the invisible boundary. For a fraction of a second, his internal perception of up and down vanished. The light from distant stars was polarized, splitting into rainbows that folded back on themselves. It was the sensation of being inside a bubble of liquid time, where gravity was not a pull, but a pressure. He gasped, fighting the momentary nausea. The shuttle's system screamed, its inertial dampeners working overtime, but Aris held steady. He was inside the cage. He looked out. The monoliths were still. Mars was still. But the reality felt fundamentally quieter. The background electromagnetic noise of space was gone, absorbed. A single point of violet light detached from the nearest monolith. It was a Custodian vessel, a sleek obsidian dart that moved without thrust or momentum, simply appearing where it needed to be. It matched the diplomat's speed. Dr. Aris Thorne, identified, vector locked. The voice, bone deep and resonant, was directed only into his helmet comms this time. Follow the beacon, approaching the silent vigil. The silent vigil. The beacon led him past the monolithic grid toward the largest of the Custodian structures, the one Aris had first seen. It was vast, dwarfing the HFY 10 times over. It was not a ship in the human sense. It was a habitat, a self-sustaining node of immense power, rotating slowly to create a semblance of artificial gravity within its hollowed core. The diplomat was guided to a docking bay, a massive aperture that yawned open in the monolith's surface. He eased the shuttle inside. The bay sealed behind him with a silent, hydraulic thunk. When the airlock hissed open, Aris stepped out onto a deck that was not metal, but what looked like polished gray basalt. The air was sterile, cool, and perfectly still. The gravity felt fractionally heavier than Earth's. The interior of the silent vigil was breathtaking in its austerity. There were no flashing lights, no wires, no discernible mechanics. The walls curved away into an immense, vaulted chamber, illuminated by shifting, ambient violet light that originated from the stone itself. And then he saw them. They were tall, nearly 3 meters, but slender, their bodies encased in segmented crystalline armor that caught and refracted the light. They had no recognizable face, only a smooth visor-like cowl that shielded whatever lay beneath. Their hands had 5 long digits, but moved with the precise, deliberate grace of a machine. They were not soldiers, they were engineers. 2 of the Custodians stood waiting for him. They didn't move toward him or make any gesture. The grinding chorus of a voice spoke, projecting from the air between the 2 beings. Greetings, Aris Thorne, unit of Sol 3. We are the Custodians. We have been watching you. We have analyzed your intent. You are the least threatening of your kind. I thank you for that assessment, Aris managed, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rush. I am here to understand. Why is Mars quarantined? The question is permissible, the voice replied. But the answer is dangerous. Your intent to begin terraforming the Red Planet is an act of galactic suicide. You attempt to unseal the sarcophagus. One of the Custodians raised a hand, and a massive holographic projection materialized in the center of the chamber. It was a perfect rotating model of Mars, its surface glowing with microscopic red dust. You mistake the rust for dirt. You mistake the silence for death. You mistake the chain for a boundary. The Custodian paused, and Aris felt an invisible wave of intense, sorrowful emotion wash over him. A profound sense of exhaustion and age that was more than just a feeling. It was a form of communication. Come, we will show you the truth of the Great Rust. We will show you why Mars must never bloom. Aris stepped forward, walking into the violet light of the alien flagship, leaving the silence of Earth behind him. Part 5. The Curator's Tale. The Archive of Rust. The Custodians led Aris Thorne deeper into the core of the silent vigil, into a chamber that pulsed with an intense, low-frequency hum. The air here was slightly charged, smelling faintly of ozone and pulverized stone. The 2 Custodians who had met him now stood on either side of a massive, concave obsidian sphere that served as the primary display. The Custodians are the Kauri. Our civilization is 12 million years old, the collective voice informed him. We are not warriors, we are curators. And this is our greatest failure. A wave of energy washed from the sphere, and Aris felt a pressure behind his eyes. The Custodians were not speaking, they were streaming memory. He was flooded with images, vast, swirling galaxies, beautiful crystalline cities, and then, suddenly, chaos. He saw a jewel-toned world orbiting a distant yellow sun. He saw the Kauri watching as silver motes of dust began to multiply on that world's surface, consuming everything: metal, flesh, soil. The images sped up, continents dissolving into a tidal wave of glittering gray, until the planet was nothing but a dead, featureless ball of pure metal particulate. The Exophage, Aris whispered, the word feeling inadequate for the cosmic horror he was witnessing. The gray goo scenario. It is greater than goo. It is sentient and ancient. We call it the hunger. Its drive is simple: consumption and replication. It feeds on heavy metals, complex carbon, and, critically, free water to facilitate its growth kinetics, the Custodians explained. The holographic projection shifted to show the Sol system 5 billion years ago. It showed a vibrant, water-rich planet orbiting where the asteroid belt now resided. Planet V. It was the first in this system to be invaded. The Exophage consumed it. What you now call the asteroid belt is the remains of its failed attempt to self-replicate after consuming everything of value. The planetary mass was insufficient to sustain its growth. The chain and the lock. The projection focused on Mars. The Terry forces, desperate after the loss of Planet V, had lured the bulk of the surviving Exophage swarm toward the fourth planet, Mars. Mars had only two advantages: its low gravity and its unique geology. It was, at the time, cooling and water-starved. The projection showed immense Qatari ships bombarding the Exophage with focused, dense streams of molecular oxygen and supercooled aerosols. We realize the swarm's primary structural integrity relies on metallic nanofilaments, the voice continued. These filaments, when exposed to high-pressure, low-temperature oxidation, become inert. They rust. They turn into the iron oxide you see today. Aris Thorne felt a dizzying epiphany. The red dust, the geology he had spent his life studying, was not a geological feature. It was a battlefield residue. The iron oxide, Aris breathed. The rust is the Exophage itself. It's the corroded skeleton of the swarm. Correct. The oxide is the chain. We buried it. We froze it. We used the planet's own failed atmosphere to crush it into permanent stasis. The entire Martian crust is a Custodian-enforced, planetary-scale, antioxidant bombardment site. The projection highlighted the massive atmospheric processors humanity had built, and are terraforming. Aris trailed off, the horrifying implications sinking in. Your Ares bloom is a reversal protocol. You intend to add heat, release trapped water, and introduce atmospheric pressure. Your fusion engines would act as a global, planetary-scale defrost cycle. You would be giving the Exophage the energy, the water, and the pressure required to break the oxide chain and replicate. The Custodian projection zoomed in on a microscopic scale, showing a rusted gray nanobot twitching faintly beneath a layer of red oxide. As a single holographic drop of water touched it, the rust peeled back, and the metallic structure began to flex, ready to consume. The weight of the secret. Aris stared, his geological certainty shattered. Mars was not a barren wasteland. It was a sarcophagus containing a galaxy-ending plague, and humanity was about to break the seal with a multi-trillion-dollar shovel. Why didn't you tell us sooner? Aris asked, the question escaping on a ragged breath. We have been silently monitoring Sol 3 for 3 million years. You were not advanced enough to receive the warning. We judged your species as too impulsive, too fragmented. "We hoped you would destroy yourselves before you reached the 4th orbit," the Custodians replied, without malice, only weary logic. "The blockade was our last resort. Your attempt to force entry with the military vessel indicates that our initial assessment of your impulsivity remains correct." They paused, the violet light dimming slightly. "The cage remains. You are our neighbors, but the safety of the galaxy must be prioritized. The Kari will maintain this vigil until the Sol system is no longer a threat to the Exophage's stasis." The Custodians raised their hands, and the display vanished, replaced by the somber gray of the basalt wall. "You will return to your command unit. You will inform them of the truth. All orbital hardware associated with the terraforming project must be immediately dismantled. Any further attempts to heat the planet, or any military action toward the cage, will be interpreted as intentional release of the Exophage. Our next action will be the nullification of Sol 3. Aris Thorne, the geologist, stood up straight. He was no longer just a scientist trying to understand an anomaly. He was a witness to an ancient terror, tasked with delivering a message that would either save humanity or fracture it irrevocably. "I understand," Aris said, his voice now firm. "I will tell them." Part 6. The Icarus Faction. The Poison Pill. Aris Thorne returned to the Sagan not as a hero, but as a contagion. He arrived carrying not a treaty, but a terrifying and unbelievable truth. General Vance met him in the airlock, his posture stiff, his eyes burning with a mix of hope and suspicion. "What is their weakness, Doctor?" Vance demanded, bypassing pleasantries. "What weapon do they fear?" "General, they fear nothing from us," Aris said, peeling off his civilian pressure suit. "They are exhausted jailers protecting us from a monster we are trying to free. Mars is the cage for a self-replicating biological machine, the Exophage. The iron oxide is the corroded shell of this plague." Aris spent the next 2 hours downloading the Custodian's memory stream, the condensed, harrowing history of the plague, the consumed planet, and the Tari's desperate, 3-million-year vigil. The data was raw, terrifying, and utterly convincing to anyone trained to read pure physics and cosmology. But Vance was trained to read people. "This is sophisticated psychological warfare, Thorne," the general spat, slamming his hand on the console. "They let you cross their line, gave you a perfectly coherent, highly visual story, and sent you back to paralyze our will. They implanted a delusion. You were exposed to their consciousness, and they poisoned you. The data is consistent, General. The gravitational distortion, the consumption of solar energy, it all aligns with a civilization focused on absolute containment. It aligns with whatever they want you to believe. The trial by committee." The descent to Earth was a blur. Within an hour of landing, Aris was standing before the UAC High Command in Geneva, projecting the Tari memories onto the massive display screen. The reaction was political, not scientific. 3 million years ago, scoffed Senator Vargo, the charismatic leader of the Terra First Party and the most powerful voice of the nationalist opposition. Vargo's party represented the trillion-credit investment tied up in the failed Ares Bloom project. They had built their entire political identity on the manifest destiny of Martian colonization. "Dr. Thorne," Vargo's voice was smooth, carrying the manufactured outrage of a seasoned demagogue. "Are you truly asking the global community to believe that the vast, empty rust ball we've been studying for 50 years is actually a sleeping, self-replicating cosmic plague? And that the only proof is a fever dream planted in your head by the very aliens who wish to steal our solar system? This is a fraud." The economic pressure was crushing. Admitting the truth meant writing off trillions in investment, accepting human limitation, and acknowledging alien superiority. It was easier, politically, to believe that the Custodians were simply liars asserting territorial claims. Vargo's voice echoed globally. "The Custodian crisis is a fabrication. The tomb is a treasure. They found something on Mars and invented a ghost story to scare us away. We are not children to be threatened by fairy tales of a gray goo." The Terra First Party instantly rebranded the Custodian's truth as the Red Scare, a coordinated campaign of interstellar colonialism. The Icarus faction strikes. While the High Command debated dissolving the Ares Bloom investment structure, the Icarus faction, a clandestine military and engineering wing loyal to Senator Vargo, was preparing its own proof. Their logic was terrifyingly simple. If the plague is real, the Custodians will have to stop the launch. If the plague is fake, Mars will bloom, and the Custodians will be exposed as frauds. Their plan centered on the Hyperion Core, a prototype orbital defense platform built in secrecy under the guise of an early warning relay. Its main payload, a heavily shielded, core-penetrating kinetic rod tipped with a small, high-yield fusion charge, was designed to melt deep bedrock. The target, Hellas Planitia, the largest impact basin on Mars, known to contain vast subsurface reservoirs of ancient frozen water ice. At 0300 local time, the rogue faction executed their strike. Hyperion is initiating launch sequence, a frantic UAC loyalist shouted into the comms in Geneva. They bypassed the lockout codes. The payload is away. General Vance, chastened but still militaristic, screamed into the comms. Stop them. Send the interceptors. Too late, General, Aris cried, watching the tactical screen with profound dread. The Hyperion platform was too far out, and the missile, a slender black dart utilizing an archaic, inefficient stealth coating, was moving too fast. The Custodians, suspended in their solemn lattice around Mars, remained silent. They did not move their monolithic ships. They did not fire a defensive warning. They had already issued their command and their threat. They were waiting for humanity to choose its fate. The contact. The fusion penetrator, disguised to look like space junk, plunged through the atmosphere of Mars at Mach 40. Its guidance was perfect. Impact occurred near the central rise of the Planitia. There was no mushroom cloud, only a momentary flash of brilliant, contained white light as the fusion core activated deep beneath the surface. The goal was achieved: vaporize the ice and superheat the surrounding rock. In Geneva, the UAC team received the seismic readings. A massive spike of subsurface heat, and the immediate release of trillions of gallons of superheated water vapor. Success! A rogue engineer cheered over the hijacked comms before the transmission was cut. Mars is heating up, the Custodians lied. Aris Thorne stared at the live Martian feed. The immense impact crater was now shrouded in a rising plume of white steam, the first sign of free, unfrozen water on the planet in 3 million years. Then, the ground around the plume began to change color. It wasn't red or white, it was silver. The iron oxide dust, the rust, the chain that bound the planet, was dissolving instantly in the thermal reaction zone. And beneath it, a glittering, mercurial sheen began to spread across the Martian surface, pulsing with a frightening, silent motion. The Custodians broke their silence. Their geometric ships shifted in orbit. Protocol Red initiated. Sol 3 has chosen. The containment has been breached. Part 7, Oxidation. The Silver Tide. The UAC war room in Geneva, which had been a crucible of political fury and military arrogance, instantly became a tomb of panicked dread. The live feed from the Hellas Planitia was no longer showing a white plume of steam. It showed a rapidly expanding, metallic tide. It's spreading at 200 kilometers per hour, the tactical officer stammered, his eyes glazed over. The periphery of the Planitia, it's all turning silver. The sensors are registering a massive, non-organic biological signature. General Vance, stripped of his bravado, leaned against the desk, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had ordered the initial containment breach. He was responsible for waking the monster. Aris Thorne stood at the central display, the Custodian memory stream now confirming his deepest fears. The Custodians had not lied. The Exophage was real, and it was replicating at an exponential rate. The thermal signature, Aris barked, pointing to the heat map. It's not uniform. It's highest where the silver meets the red. It's using the heat from the Hyperion core to crack the water ice, and using the resultant liquid water as a catalyst. Professor Harmon, looking defeated, adjusted her glasses and read the chemical analysis from the Martian probes that were now being consumed. It's a reverse oxidation. The exophage, which is essentially frozen, oxidized iron-based nanomachinery, is absorbing the thermal energy. It's using the water as an electrolyte to rapidly reduce the iron oxide back into self-replicating metallic filaments. The exophage is eating the rust that was supposed to kill it. The military term consuming was replaced by the biological horror, replication. The silver sheen was the active, hungry swarm, repairing itself with the inert body parts of its 3-million-year-old ancestors. The protocol read. The Custodians finally responded, not with a targeted threat, but with a pure data dump, a catastrophic flow of real-time predictive modeling. Replication rate is exceeding inertial quota. Estimated time to global Mars, conversion, 78 hours. Estimated time to atmospheric launch capability, 120 hours. The projection showed a gruesome simulation, the silver tide quickly consuming the entire planet, achieving critical mass, and then launching itself into space, a glittering, intelligent dust cloud aimed directly at Sol 3, Earth. "We have to stop it. Can we bomb the site?" Vance pleaded, his face streaming with sweat. "No," Aris shouted. "A nuclear blast would only provide more heat, more energy, and release more trapped water. We would be speeding up the process." The war room descended into chaos. The Terra First Party leadership, including Senator Vargo, had vanished, either in fear or to prepare for the inevitable blame shifting. Aris knew they had only one recourse, reversing the Qatari's original containment protocol. The Qatari used massive oxygen bombardment and supercooling to freeze it 3 million years ago. Aris grabbed Professor Harmon. "We have to do the opposite of what the Hyperion core did. We need rapid extreme cooling and massive pressure." "But our atmospheric processors are useless," Lena countered, pointing to the holographic lattice of the Custodian cage. "They're still outside the perimeter. We can't reach the surface." "We can't use them to heat the planet," Aris argued, his mind racing. "But what if we could convince the Custodians to let us use them to freeze it? We need to use the Ares Bloom hardware to pump ultra-cold, dense gases onto the site, freezing the water and reoxidizing the silver tide instantly." He rushed to the communications console and began broadcasting a targeted plea on the Custodian frequency, ignoring the UA High Command's panic. "Custodians, Qatari, this is Aris Thorne. Sol 3 apologizes for the breach. We are requesting use of the Ares Bloom processors, not for ignition, but for extinguishing. We have data, the original containment protocol. We can reverse the exophage's kinetics if we are allowed access to the hardware." The final shift. For a terrifying minute, there was no reply. The silver tide on Mars continued its relentless expansion. Then, the resonant thrum returned, louder than before. The Custodian monoliths, which had formed a defensive cage around Mars, now began to move in unison. They did not disassemble. They rotated, aligning their enormous mass. But they were not aligning their geometric shields toward the exophage. They were aligning their main energy outputs toward Earth. The light emanating from the monoliths changed from violet to a deep, ominous blue, the color of extreme cold and impending annihilation. The UAQ sensors immediately registered a massive buildup of energy. The Custodian response was brief and final. Sol 3 has demonstrated the inability to comply. The exophage threat is now insufficiently contained. Custodian Protocol Zeta initiated. Global sterilization for interstellar safety. The screens in Geneva flashed red. The Custodians were preparing to fire. Their solution to the exophage waking up was simple: destroy its next host planet before the plague could jump the gulf of space. "They're going to use the gravity distortion field," Vance choked out, finally understanding. They're not going to blow us up. They're going to nullify our atmosphere. We'll freeze and vacuum out instantly. Custodians, wait! Aris screamed into the comms, but the signal was drowned out by the rising, overwhelming hum of the Custodian's power buildup. The fate of Earth now depended on whether Aris Thorne could get through to the Ktari before they initiated the calculated genocide of humanity. Part 8. The Sterilization Protocol. Ice emoji. The nullification signal. The war room was now running on emergency battery power, the main lights extinguished. Through the reinforced viewport, the atmosphere was a sickly, pale yellow, not because of the sun, but because the upper layers of Earth's atmosphere were being ionized by the Custodian's Protocol Zeta buildup. The monoliths around Mars, now aligned perfectly to Earth, pulsed with a terrible, intense cerulean blue. This was the energy signature of a massive, focused gravitational torsion field preparing to peel the atmosphere from the surface of the planet. "We have 2 minutes to predicted critical failure," Professor Harmon whispered, clutching Aris's arm. "They're targeting the Van Allen belts. It's elegant. They're going to strip away the magnetic shield and then the air." The very air in the war room seemed to thin. The floor plates trembled with a resonant frequency that was not mechanical but cosmic, the sound of space-time being stressed. General Vance, huddled over a console, looked up at Aris. "Thorne, they're not listening. They've shut down all non-essential comms. It's an automated sequence now." Aris shoved Vance aside, seizing the primary broadcast link. He bypassed the UX jamming and military codes, feeding his plea through the same neutral frequency used during his initial contact. He didn't speak to their emotions, he spoke to their logic. "Custodians, Ktari, this is Aris Thorne. You must halt Protocol Zeta. Your current action is a suboptimal containment strategy." The blue light intensified. The thrumming grew louder. "The Exophage will survive atmospheric collapse," Aris shouted, projecting the original Qatari containment data onto the screen, a language of physics the Custodians could not ignore. "Your own data shows the organism can enter stasis upon vacuum exposure, only to revive upon interaction with a heavier planetary mass. Sterilization is only 60% effective." He frantically keyed in a sequence, projecting a simplified thermodynamic model of the current Martian situation. "Observe the current kinetics, Qatari. The Exophage is utilizing liquid $\text H _2 text $O as a replication catalyst. The immediate crisis is the water cycle. The original Curie containment protocol relied on thermal shock, instantaneous conversion of liquid water to solid ice. That is the only method with a 99.99% success rate for immediate arrest." Aris paused, breathless, the Custodian blue light bathing his face. He pointed at the image of the derelict Ares Bloom processors, now trapped outside the perimeter. "We possess the hardware for the optimal containment." The Ares Bloom processors, when reversed, are massive atmospheric condensers. They can deliver 100 terajoules of localized negative, 400 Kelvin cooling directly onto the Exophage site. This converts liquid water to ice and completes the reoxidation process instantly. The Ares Bloom is not a bomb, it is the fail-safe. The data verdict. For agonizing seconds, the blue light held. On the screen, the replication rate of the Exophage on Mars continued to soar. The Kari were assessing the data in real time. Human pleading was irrelevant. Superior logic was paramount. Then, the terrible synthetic chorus of the Custodian voice returned, cutting through the rising static. "Stand by." Protocol Zeta paused, re-evaluating input. The blue light dimmed to a faint, pulsing violet. The gravity field stabilized. Earth did not perish. Input data Thorne, confirmed. Thermal shock protocol is the superior containment method. The risk assessment of Sol-3, catastrophe, is now acceptable. Your plan is granted operational status. Aris sank against the console, his legs shaking, the adrenaline crash hitting him instantly. Condition: Custodian control is now primary. General Vance and all Sol-3 military assets are to be removed from orbit immediately. Dr. Thorne will be the sole executor of the counter-protocol. He will return to the Sagan, now under Custodian quarantine, to initiate the reversal. The Custodians were not allies. They were temporary contractors. You are granted a time window of 52 hours to achieve arrest of replication. Failure to comply will result in the immediate, unpaused resumption of Protocol Zeta. The new command. Within the hour, the UA's remaining military vessels were forced to retreat back toward the Moon and Earth, shoved out of orbit by invisible fields of gravity. General Vance, stripped of his command and humbled by his role in almost causing human extinction, was ordered back to Earth to face trial. Aris Thorne was sent back to the Sagan, which now floated silently in Mars orbit, stripped of its weaponry and surrounded by two silent, smaller Custodian ships, escorts ensuring compliance. As he looked out at Mars, the expanding silver sheen was visible now, consuming the red surface like spilled mercury. The clock was ticking. He had 52 hours to take the greatest heating engines in human history and turn them into the greatest planetary freezer. Professor Harmon, Aris said over the secure line to Earth, his voice heavy with responsibility. Send me all the schematics for the Ares Bloom condensers. We're going to use everything we have to turn that hellfire into absolute zero. Part 9. Absolute zero, cold face emoji. The last 48 hours. The atmosphere inside the UNS Sagan was colder than the vacuum outside. General Vance and all military personnel had departed, leaving the ship a ghost vessel, monitored by two silent Custodian escorts floating 100 meters off the hull. Dr. Aris Thorne was the sole human inhabitant, working furiously at the command deck, the weight of the 52-hour Custodian deadline crushing him. On the main viewport, Mars was visibly sick. The silver tide, the active exophage swarm, had consumed nearly 15% of the surface of Hellas Planitia, and was spreading up the walls of the Valles Marineris, racing to reach the equator, where temperatures were higher. The replication rate, displayed on the Custodian-linked diagnostics, was accelerating. Aris had 48 hours left to initiate the only known cure. Aris, we have the core code isolated. Professor Harmon's voice, strained and distant, came through the tight beam channel from Earth. But the thermodynamic reversal is catastrophic. The fusion generators for the atmospheric processors are designed for a positive Joule-Thomson coefficient, compressing gas to produce heat. We need to force a negative coefficient to produce massive cooling. I know, Lena, Aris replied, sweat dripping from his temples. We have to flip the cycle. We need to use the energy of the fusion core not to generate heat, but to create a massive pressure differential and vent the resultant supercooled gases. Xenon $text CO_$2. Anything dense, directly onto the breach site. The technical challenge was immense. Reversing the flow meant overriding 24 critical safety locks designed to prevent the fusion core from destabilizing under reversed pressure. If they failed, the processors wouldn't just stop working. They would melt down and accelerate the exophage spread with an uncontrollable heat surge. Code red, reversal. Aris and the Earth-based engineering team worked in silent, frantic coordination. They were operating on the limits of human endurance and machine tolerance. For 40 hours, the comms were filled with terse, whispered instructions. Bypass lock 7 gamma. Use the secondary shunt to reroute the plasma exhaust. Lena, the flow regulators are seizing up. We need to manually cycle the inertials now. The Custodians watched, their silent escort ships projecting data streams confirming that every action was logged and analyzed. They offered no assistance, only cold, absolute observation. As the clock ticked down to 1 hour remaining, Aris felt the Sagan shudder. Aris, we're ready, Harmon whispered. The flow is reversed. We're running at 10% capacity. It's stable, but the internal pressures are maxed. We bypassed the final safety lock on your command. Once we do this, there is no stopping it. Aris looked at the screen. The silver tide had consumed a fifth of the Hellas Planitia. It was starting to bubble, reaching the temperature where it would begin to climb into the thin atmosphere. He looked up at the closest Custodian escort, its black facade impassive. They were still projecting the dim, ominous violet light of the paused Protocol Zeta. Final lock bypass initiated, Aris confirmed, his finger hovering over the fire control. Lena, give me everything you have. We need absolute zero on that site now. The thermal shock. At T-3 minutes, Aris slammed his hand onto the activation plate. The 700 atmospheric processors spread across Mars did not ignite. They exhaled. From the nozzles built to belch fire, there erupted massive, silent, brilliant plumes of blue-white gas. It was the raw cold of supercondensed atmospheric compounds, vented under phenomenal pressure. The plumes arched across the Martian landscape, a celestial blanket of frost. The target was the silver patch in Hellas Planitia. The collision was instant and violent. The super-cold gases hit the liquid water and the metallic exophage filaments. The energy transfer was staggering. A colossal, mushroom-shaped cloud of frozen $TextCO_$2 snow and flash-frozen water vapor erupted high into the tenuous atmosphere. The silver tide did not retreat. It simply stopped. The violent replication, the bubbling and spreading, froze in a moment of pure thermodynamic shock. The silver reverted instantly to a dull, inert gray, coated in a thick, insulating layer of white ice. The verdict. In the war room, Aris and the Custodian monitoring system both registered the same reading. Exophage replication. Rate. Brazilian real sub T equals $0. The exponential curve had flatlined. The immediate threat was arrested. A profound, exhausted silence settled over the Sagan. Aris slumped back in his chair, too drained to cheer. The clock on the Custodian timeline hit 0. The two silent escort ships moved closer to the Sagan. The grinding chorus returned, not with celebration, but with a cold, detached assessment. Containment arrest achieved. The exophage is in stasis. The Custodians paused, their final verdict hanging in the frozen air. However, the risk assessment remains unacceptably high. Sol 3 demonstrated a willingness to invoke catastrophe for territorial impulse. We cannot rely on the continued cooperation of impulsive species. The violet light around Mars intensified slightly. Protocol Zeta remains on standby. We will now initiate permanent planetary scale custody. Part 10. The Watcher's Ringed Planet. The Permanent Vigil. 3 weeks after the successful thermal shock, the region around Hellas Planitia remained frozen solid, a vast, blinding white scar of ultra-cold ice and inert, gray exophage particulate. The crisis was averted, but the Custodians were not satisfied with mere temporary arrest. The great black monoliths of the Custodian fleet began to reconfigure. They were disassembled piece by piece, their material used to construct a permanent low-altitude orbital infrastructure directly above the exophage site. This massive undertaking created the cryo-lattice, a fixed, self-sustaining magnetic shield that funneled solar radiation away from the impact site and continuously pumped supercooled, inert gases onto the exposed surface. Mars was not just quarantined. It was now structurally sound, chemically stable, and eternally frozen in place. Dr. Aris Thorne watched the final construction from the Sagan, which was now permanently docked to a large Custodian monitoring station. He was no longer a civilian scientist, but the sole point of communication between two civilizations. The Custodian chorus resonated within the command deck, addressing him one final time with their terms for non-interference. The containment is complete. Mars is now a permanent galactic biohazard site. The cryptonymic code for this sector is restricted. Custodian vigilance will continue for 100,000 Sol 3 rotations. terms of compliance are as follows. No nuclear fusion greater than 50 megawatts is permitted in Mars orbit. No attempt at atmospheric modification of Mars is permitted. Any attempt to circumvent the cryptonymic code will be interpreted as a reignition protocol. Sol 3 is not imprisoned. It is now a protected neighbor. We will interfere no further with your internal politics or your planetary development. Your ambitions must simply be redirected. The great fleet of monolithic ships, their mission completed, slowly began to exit the solar system, disappearing via the same quiet, instantaneous space-time folds they had used to arrive. They left behind only the massive, silent, geometric cryolattice, glowing faintly with violet sentinel lights. The custodians were gone, but the watchers remained. The fallout and redirection. On Earth, the political reality shattered. Senator Vargo and the entire Terra First leadership were arrested and faced charges ranging from sabotage to involuntary manslaughter. The populace, having seen the silent, instantaneous power of the custodians and the terrifying logic of the Exophage, fully embraced the new reality. The dream of Mars died, but the realization of the vastness of the universe and the limits of human knowledge was born. The trillions of dollars of investment slated for Mars were immediately redirected to the challenging, yet ultimately safer, target, Venus. The goal was no longer to create a breathable, familiar world, but to build buoyant, floating, atmospheric colonies, cities in the clouds, high above the crushing heat. It was a humbling ambition, driven by necessity rather than expansionist confidence. Aris Thorne became the reluctant hero, the man who had spoken truth to power, both human and alien. He returned to Earth not to retire, but to serve as the chief liaison for the newly formed Solar System Custodial Office, SSCO. His life was now dictated by the steady, measured data streams flowing from the cryo-lattice. He was the perpetual warden of the human race, ensuring the peace that came at the cost of a future. The rust boundary. 1 year later, Aris stood at the viewport of the new lunar SSCO station. Earth was a brilliant blue sphere. Mars was a quiet red disk, scarred by the new geometry of the Custodian infrastructure. Professor Harmon joined him, watching the feed from the Martian surface, the desolate, familiar red of the ancient rust, now interspersed with the bright, sterile white of the Kayari containment structure. The latest Venus project reports look good, Aris, Lena said, placing a hand on his shoulder. We're focusing outward, learning patience. Perhaps they did us a favor. They forced us to grow up. Maybe, Aris said, staring at the distant, frozen continent. But we learned a terrible lesson. The universe isn't a playground waiting to be claimed. It's an ancient house filled with dangers we can't comprehend, and Mars is the closed door to the basement. He looked at the red dust, the fossilized remains of the exophage. He remembered the custodian's final, logical statement. The oxide is the chain. Humanity would never walk on Mars. It was not our birthright. It was the galaxy's final defense. And Aris Thorne would be the one to ensure the seal was never broken again. He was the liaison, the witness, and the first of the watchers. He sighed, adjusted his display, and checked the temperature readings on the cryo-lattice. The great Martian tomb was holding. The silence remained.